What did you ask, AdalisaZ? Do I understand these rights as you explain them to me? Gory, what makes some men so numb? No, you never mind. Still your jawing and listen to me for a while. I got an idea that you're gonna be listening to me most of the night, so you might as well get used to it. 'Cause I understand what you read to me. Do I look like I lost all my brain since I seen you down on the market? That was just Monday afternoon, in case you lost track. I told you your wife would give you merry hell about buying that day-old bread. Penny wise and pound foolish, the old saying is, and I bet I was right, wasn't I? We start 2023 with Stephen King's 20th novel, with Break cut out of the norm as it's a novel without chapters, breaks, or formatting, since it's all told in first person as a transcript from a police interview. This may also make it a bit hard to read in English for non-native speakers, as it's filled with the main accent written phonetically, which I just completely destroyed, and I am sorry about that. I'm talking about Dolores Claiborne, published in 1992, which is one of those understated jewels in King's output. It is also one of the very few novels where we know that King had a specific person in mind while writing the book, in case it was adapted to a movie someday, which it was in 1995, precisely with the actress that he had pictured while writing Dolores in the main role, the amazing Kathy Bates, whom he had met when she was cast as Annie Wilkes for the Misery movie adaptation. Not only that, but it's sort of connected to our previous novel, Gerald's Games, as it continues to tackle the general consequences and horrors of both domestic abuse and child molestation, which became the central subject of some of his novels past Gerald's Game and all the way up to Rose Madder. I'm AdalisaZ, and today I warn you we are going to need brooms and dustpans to fight the dust bunnies and the horrors of the past as we listen to the story of Dolores Claiborne. As I mentioned in the Gerald's Games video, King has been talking in the background about the horrors of domestic abuse all the way down since Carrie, where the violence in question was from the mother to the child, in a very specific religious guided way. However, that one could be a bit ignored since, well, Margaret did have a reason to believe her daughter was a spawn of the devil, and not just that Carrie was conceived when her husband Ralph raped her. Carrie had powers, and with Margaret's madness, well, we may not approve of what Margaret did, but we can see her as an outlier and not an example of how society in general approves of discipline at home. In fact, even within the novel, the people who didn't know about Carrie's power criticized Margaret's methods and wanted to take the little girl away from her. But as I pointed out, it kept happening. In The Shining, in The Dead Zone, as Greg Stilson was definitely not a man who kept his hands to himself when it came to his anger. In It, with both physical and psychological abuse from the parents of the losers, as well as the less mentioned kind of abuse, neglect. But all of these moments were, at all times, a B-plot that could have been seen as just a part of the life in a little Maine town without extra judgment. This changed with Gerald's Game, when we got to see the terrible consequences of psychological domestic violence and how it affected a woman who was not realizing how much it affected her until she was pushed to an extreme. But it's still a completely private matter for Jessie. She doesn't want other people to know what's going on in her marriage. In fact, one of her many nightmares is that if she dies in bed, people will get ideas of how that happened. And it focuses way more in the molestation she suffered as a child than in the psychological abuse she suffered at Gerald's hands. Mostly because, just as she's remembering that yes, what her father did to her was abuse, and he did willingly and knowingly, she finally realizes how terrible Gerald was as a husband. This is not the case of Dolores Claiborne. Here, King doesn't only tackles what domestic abuse looks like and does to a woman in her house, he also includes how society used to see women in the 60s and all the way to the early 80s, why some of them stayed with their abusers, and yes, even world-class abuse. For a 305 pages novel, which is short for his usual fare of this era, this is a lot to tackle. Oh, he also goes back to child molestation, because it's part of the arc of the era. So, what is the story of Dolores Claiborne? Well, it is the story of Dolores Claiborne, but let me elaborate. The story begins with Dolores talking to the cops about the fact that they believe that she killed her employer, Vera Donovan, and she wants to clear her name. She didn't kill Vera, an octogenary, even if she was found on top of the dead woman holding a rolling pin, and days before people heard her yell at Vera that she would kill her one day. Nope. She is completely innocent of that death. However, she did kill her husband, Joe St. George, 29 years ago. And she wants to set the record straight on why she killed him, given that everyone thinks that she did it anyway, even if they couldn't prove it, and that if she's going to go to jail, she's going to go to jail for the crime that she committed, not for the one she didn't. Not only that, she's sure that once the cops listen to the story of how Vera Donovan died, and how she, Dolores, killed Joe St. George on the day of a solar eclipse in 1963, and how her life was with both Joe and Vera, they will believe that she's telling the truth about both deaths. And so, she begins by telling them how she ended up becoming Vera Donovan's housekeeper and main caretaker just after Joe died. First things first. Dolores Claiborne may be a short novel, especially by King's normal output, but it's not an easy novel to read. Not just because of the subject matter, where as usual King doesn't pull any punches when it comes to describing the horrors of child abuse and domestic violence or the advance of dementia, but also because, being written in Dolores' voice, sometimes the fact that he wrote main sense phonetically may make it hard to read and understand. So fair warning there, it's not a good book to be your first King's book. Because it is told by Dolores, it also has some interesting jumps in the timeline. She doesn't start with, "It all began when I married Joe," and ends with, "and this is how Vera died." Instead, she goes from talking about Vera and her issues, to then how she stopped Joe abusing her, then back to Vera and how horrible it was to work for her, then once again to the horrible things Joe did to their daughter, and so on. So there are a few things that have to be read between the lines. The relationship between Dolores Claiborne and her boss, Vera Donovan, is central to the novel, because it shows how two women who are separated by class and privilege are yet in the exact same situation when it comes to societal expectations. And I know this may be laughable when we compare the two on paper, because, well, they couldn't be more different. Dolores is a local woman who began working cleaning other people's houses because her husband was not exactly able to hold a job and not to spend money on himself instead of his family. She has 3 kids, a girl, Serena, and 2 boys, Joe Jr. and Pete. All of them underage, and she has to tie her purse strings to keep money on the 3 banks account for their college funds. She is also badly beaten by her husband from time to time, something that everybody in town knows and in fact may exaggerate. But she just takes it because, well, she believes it's what husbands do to their wives, and it's just a natural thing within a marriage. Vera, on the other hand, is an outsider to Little Tall Island. A summer woman who only comes to the island for the warm months and then leaves, at least up until she becomes a widower. She has 2 children, a son and a daughter, but after a big fight they are never seen again in the island, not even after Vera moves permanently there. Vera has money, like a lot of money, so she's used to be heard and obeyed. And while we don't really know how her married life was, the whole town was convinced that she was the one who wore the pants in the relationship, mostly because when they saw her husband, Mr. Donovan was always doing what his wife wanted. But the truth is, both are trapped by the way in which society sees women, no matter their money, education, or position in society. While we know from the beginning that Dolores would end up working permanently for Vera and talking to her as if she was an old friend rather than her boss, it's not until the middle of the novel when we finally know how Vera went from being Miss Donovan to Vera, and how they started a hesitant friendship, and it is because Dolores finally breaks down to pressure. See, while she had managed to stop Joe from beating her by literally beating the hell out of him once and reminding him that if he killed her, he would end up in jail, where there is no booze. She also found out that Joe had done everything he could do to their daughter short of raping her after that. And when she tried to go and get the college funds for their 3 kids in order to get away from Joe and Little Tall Island, she found out that the bank had given Joe the money when he claimed that he had lost the bank deposit books that Joe kept hidden from him to avoid precisely that. This despite the fact that the account had been opened by both Joe and Dolores, and if only one parent came to get the money away, the bank was supposed to call the other to make sure that the withdrawal was by mutual decision. Why? Well, because Joe was the man. Dolores even asked the bank if they would have called him if he had come to do the same thing as he had done, and the answer is a very telling silence. And so, thanks to this action of economical abuse and societal misogyny, she is trapped. She is sure that no matter how much she keeps an eye on Joe, he will end up touching Serena again, while ruining their youngest kid with his racism and hate, and their middle kid will end up lost. With all this, she cries her heart out in front of Vera, despite trying to be professional in front of her, sure that Vera would fight her immediately. But Vera surprises her with a phrase that I am sure many women thought to themselves before the no-fault divorce was legal in the US. An accident is sometimes an unhappy woman's best friend. Of course, this is partly because of the era. We must remember that no-fault divorce wasn't legal in Maine until 1973, when you didn't have to give an explanation of why you wanted to divorce your husband. But before that, a woman had to jump through many hoops to prove that she needed a divorce. Besides, getting a divorce would not give Dolores the money that Joe had stolen from her children back, and the constant beatings that she endured from Joe, both the ones that she did endure before giving him a piece of his own medicine, and the ones the town decided that she endured even if he hadn't touched her in those times, were not enough to prove that she needed a divorce, because back then people believed that was the right of the husband, an idea that even Dolores admitted that she believed back then before she realized that it was, well, bullshit. But the main theme of Dolores Claiborne is not the mistreatment of women alone, although it's quite noticeable during the whole novel. No, the main theme is guilt, because every woman in the story feels guilt over something, even over things that were not under their control. The most clear-cut case, of course, is Dolores and her feelings over Joe's death. She knows that she's guilty of that, and later we find out that she has nightmares about it. Nightmares about Joe coming out of the well and killing her too, but even worse, nightmares about Serena blaming herself for what happened and hurting herself for it. Dolores also wonders if Serena doesn't feel guilt herself, despite being the most innocent person in the novel. Because, see, Serena separated herself from her family as soon as she could go to college, and now, in the present of the novel, she rarely calls home, because she drinks a lot, just like her dad used to. We don't know why Serena drinks, but Dolores suspects it's due to the terrible memories she wants to forget. In the movie, in fact, we get the confirmation of this, as Serena honestly doesn't remember her trauma thanks to time, alcohol, and a lot of Daniel, and this puts her against her mother for most of the runtime. But we also have Vera's guilt. And that one is only made absolutely clear by the end of the novel, because that is when Dolores finally gets all the information that she needs to understand her boss friend. We know that Vera killed her husband. She never outright says it so, but as I said, you read between the lines, Vera killed her husband. That is not up to debate because she sideways confesses it to Dolores when she plants the idea that Dolores may kill her own husband too. Husbands die every day. But for most of the novel, we are to believe that Vera really didn't feel much for her dead husband at all. She kept on with her life and didn't change anything. Of course, she had nightmares about dust bunnies. Dolores makes it clear that they were horrible for her, and she thinks that those dust bunnies may have the face of Vera's husband. But those hallucinations at first seem to be caused more by Vera's growing senile dementia than by actual guilt that she consciously feels. Dolores calls those days the bad days, and Vera herself seems to know in her good days that the hallucinations are just that, hallucinations brought by her guilt. But at the very end of the book, Dolores finds out the truth. It's not only Vera's husband who is dead. but also her children, whom she talked about as if they were alive the whole time until her own death. The children died in another car accident after a terrible fight with the younger one driving, because Vera allowed her to get her driving licenses at 14, which was possible in Maine back then, and in a car that Vera had brought for the older one, who was only 16. So she's also feeling guilt for something that, in the end, was not entirely her fault, but she feels it was. And then her signature line, "Sometimes being a bitch is all that a woman has left," makes so much more sense. And as I said, it's just a study of guilt and how it affects us, and how sometimes the real guilt party, in this case Joe, the way he treated his daughter, are the ones that are left scot-free, unless of course an accident happens. Just as Gerald games before it, Dolores Claiborne is quite dark due to the subject matter. However, it's not that good of an introduction to Stephen King, as I said before, because of the first-person POV, which is not very common in King's long novels, and the phonetically written accent that at times can become a bit confusing, and I say that as someone who has read Dolores Claiborne 5 times. But also it's very short, and if you like A Gerald's Game, you will also enjoy Dolores Claiborne, especially as there's the very faint connection between the two books. Spoiler, it doesn't really get anywhere except to give the eclipse a little more of a mystical nature, but it's still a reminder that in King's world, everything is a bit connected. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica, and Ellie Riley, as well as my first supporters Tanya Pineda and Amy Sunk, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos would not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, written link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell, and with just $1 a month you will be always thanked in my videos as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or if you prefer a one-off offer, at Coffee with just one donation of $3 you will get a mention in the next 3 videos I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. Now, the eclipse is truly over. So we are going to move back to Derry, where the evil of Pennywise may be gone, but that doesn't mean that there is no evil left. There, we will meet Ralph Roberts and find out why insomnia can be both a curse and a blessing.